The sky over Dixon, Illinois had a burnt orange glow as the setting sun cast its light over rows of pristine houses in the new Oakwood Lane development. The Herrington family's home stood at the far end, its gray-blue siding and black shutters gleaming in the evening light. Fresh landscaping and a just-poured driveway hinted at the home's newness, a clean slate, at least in appearance. Brian Herrington stepped out of the U-Haul, rubbing the back of his neck and letting out a groan. Whoever said moving is fun never moved their whole family in one weekend, he muttered. His steel-toed boots thudded against the driveway, a reminder of how often work and family life overlapped. As an architectural engineer, he'd spent the last year designing this neighborhood, and getting a discount on the property had seemed like a dream come true, until the backbreaking labor of packing and hauling set in. Samantha, his wife, leaned against the front door, her face half hidden behind a takeout menu she was fanning herself with. "Please tell me you're not going to make me cook tonight," she said, eyes narrowing as Brian approached. Brian held up his hands in mock surrender. "Pizza. Extra large. Your choice of toppings." Cameron, their boy, at 12 years old, bounced between boxes in the driveway, still full of energy despite the long day. His buzz cut made his freckles more pronounced, and his Spider-Man t-shirt was streaked with sweat and dirt. "Mom! Dad! Look at this bug!" he yelled, holding up a beetle with the enthusiasm only a kid could muster. "Ew, buddy," Samantha chuckled. "Let's keep your new friends outside, okay?" Cameron giggled, shrugged, and trotted over to show his dad. Brian ruffled his hair, laughing. "Maybe leave our new neighbors out of your insect discoveries for now, okay, bud?" Inside the house was a maze of boxes, half-assembled furniture, and scattered belongings. Samantha was already eyeing the mountain of unpacking ahead with a sigh. "This better be worth it," she muttered, though the open-concept kitchen and big backyard gave her a glimmer of hope. They made their way to the living room, where the last rays of sunlight lit up the dust motes dancing through the air. The makeshift dinner setup, a stack of cardboard boxes turned into a table, looked both ridiculous and perfect for their first night. As they gathered around, pizza boxes now open, Brian lifted his soda can in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. Cameron added an enthusiastic, "Cheers!" before scarfing down a slice. The family laughed about the chaos of moving, joked about the neighbors they hadn't met yet, and wondering if they'd ever find the box that held the TV remote. The Herrington family's new house stood tall, a modern take on a rustic farmhouse, tucked away from the main roads, surrounded by the quiet, rolling fields of Dixon. It was the kind of place that was picture-perfect on a postcard, with a large wraparound porch and enough open space to let Cameron run free. Inside, it was organized chaos. Boxes cluttered every room, half empty and stacked against the freshly painted walls. The smell of new wood mixed with the scent of packing tape and dust, the air heavy with the feeling of starting over. "Where's my Xbox?" Cameron bellowed out, digging through a box labeled Cameron's Room. His voice carried a distinct whine, paired with a dramatic sigh that only teenagers seemed to master. "Try looking where your mom labeled it," Brian called back, carrying a box labeled Kitchen Fragile into the other room. He was trying to keep the mood light, but his voice held the tension of a man still feeling the weight of the move. His bonus had gotten them this place, but unpacking felt like a mountain still left to climb. Samantha was the nucleus, the one keeping it all together. "KFC tonight?" she called out from the kitchen, her hair in a loose bun, sleeves rolled up as she attempted to organize the pantry. "I'm thinking we earned another night off from cooking." "Yes, please!" Cameron, making comments about dining with the Colonel. Brian set down the box he was holding and took a moment to soak in the view from the back window. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the fields. For a second, he felt a sense of peace. It was hard-earned, and he needed to believe that uprooting his family for this new life was worth it. After dinner, Cameron finally managed to uncover his gaming console. "Victory!" he shouted, holding it above his head like a trophy. He dashed past the living room and made a beeline for his new space. Samantha came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stood beside Brian. "We'll make this home, right?" she asked, a note of hope in her voice. Brian put an arm around her. "Yeah," he replied, looking out into the horizon. "We just need time." Outside, the last rays of sunlight kissed the horizon, shadows creeping in as night claimed the land. The wind rustled gently through the tall grass. "Enough screen time for today," Samantha said, her tone a mix of motherly patience and finality. "Go outside, explore. We've got all this land now, and you're not going to spend every second glued to that game." Cameron groaned. His controller dropped into his lap. "Outside?" he echoed, like she had suggested something as archaic as churning butter. "Mom, there's nothing out there." "There's plenty," she insisted, pushing aside a half-unpacked box to make room on the counter. "Go on, take your phone if you want. Just be back before dinner." Reluctantly, he trudged out the door, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. The autumn air was crisp, the kind of weather that hinted at the coming winter, but still carried a lingering warmth from the afternoon sun. He kicked at the loose gravel in the driveway, glancing back at the house like he might be called back in to help unpack. No such luck. With nothing better to do, he crossed the lawn and ventured into the wooded area that bordered their property. Trees stood tall and unmoving. Leaves rustled in the breeze. The ground littered with brittle branches and fallen acorns. Cameron walked aimlessly, taking half-hearted swipes at low-hanging branches and letting his sneakers scuff against the dirt. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon something curious. There was a section of earth that looked disturbed, as though something had recently been dug up or buried. His curiosity piqued. He got down on one knee and started to brush away the loose soil with his hands. The dirt was cool, and he worked quickly, eager to uncover whatever was hidden beneath. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something hard. Cameron's heart thumped as he unearthed a rusted tomahawk. Its blade chipped, and its handle splintered with age. The object had a dark, almost foreboding energy about it, but Cameron was too intrigued to care. He lifted it, the weight surprising in his hand. "This is so cool," he murmured, a rare spark of excitement lighting up his expression. A part of him knew he should show his parents, but something made him hesitate. The tomahawk felt like a secret, a treasure meant only for him. So he slid it under his hoodie, the cold metal pressing against his side as he hurried back toward the house. Once in his room, Cameron shut the door and pulled the tomahawk out. He inspected it closely, running his fingers over the rusted blade and the worn carvings on the handle. It was old, ancient even, and something about this thrilled him. His mind raced with thoughts of Native American warriors, battlefields, and buried history. Not wanting anyone to discover it, he found a hiding spot. Carefully, he pulled open his bottom dresser drawer, pushing aside a pile of mismatched socks and shirts. He laid the tomahawk flat beneath them, covering it like a buried relic once again. Perfect, he whispered, satisfied. Downstairs, the faint clatter of dinner preparations reached his ears. He closed the drawer, the thrill of his find still buzzing through him, and he promised himself he'd come back to it later. At dinner, the Herringtons gathered around their new dining table, the unpacked boxes scattered in the background. Steam rose from bowls of Samantha's homemade chili, and the warm glow of the overhead light gave the room a cozy feel. Cameron picked at his meal, his mind still on the tomahawk hidden in his dresser. "So," his dad said between bites, "did you find anything interesting outside today?" Cameron shook his head quickly. "Nope," he replied, stuffing a spoonful of chili into his mouth to avoid further questions. "Just trees and dirt." "See?" Samantha chimed in. "I told you there's plenty to explore. Maybe you'll find something cool if you give it more time." "Yeah, maybe," Cameron mumbled, his heart pounding. He hadn't felt guilty for lying, not until that moment, but he swallowed it down, convincing himself it was no big deal. It wasn't like they understood how important the tomahawk felt, how it was to him. Dinner wrapped up with talk of unpacking and plans for the Thanksgiving ahead. By the time Cameron got ready for bed, the tomahawk felt like a distant memory, tucked away safely in his drawer. The evening fell into a hush as the house settled for the night. Cameron lay in bed. His makeshift blanket, made from a sleeping bag, felt warm and snug, pulled up to his chin. His parents' soft laughter drifted up from the living room, and he tried to let it soothe him to sleep. But sleep came uneasily. Hours later, something jolted him awake. His room was bathed in shadows, the kind that made the corners of his vision flicker and his heart race. Cameron sat up, rubbing his eyes, feeling the heavy press of the darkness around him. Then he heard it, a faint, whispering chant. "Blood and earth, bone and spirit." He swallowed hard, the childish fear creeping up his spine. He told himself it was the wind rustling through the trees, but deep down, he knew better. The whispers didn't belong in his room, and yet they were here, crawling through the air like invisible insects. A shadow moved across his wall, quick and silent. Cameron's breath hitched as he clutched his blanket tighter. The shadow didn't look human, and for a heartbeat, he wondered if someone or something had slipped in while he was sleeping. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The air in his room had turned thick, suffocating, like the house had been sealed up tight. He could feel the pounding of his heart beneath his blanket. He tried to close his eyes, but the whispers grew louder. "The sins of the fathers, spilled blood, still hungry." Cameron threw his blanket off, shivering as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The room felt colder than it should have. The heat seemingly sapped away. He crept to his dresser, thinking maybe he'd felt the windows open, but the window was shut, the lock latched tight. His fingers itched to check the tomahawk, to make sure it was still there. Before he could convince himself otherwise, he yanked open the bottom drawer. There it was, right where he'd left it. But now, the rusted blade seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing. Cameron staggered back, the drawer sliding shut on its own. A laugh, low, dark, and mocking, filled the room, and he stumbled, tripping over his own feet. He crawled back into bed, heart racing, as the laughter faded into the night. The whispers fell silent, leaving him in a room that felt hollow and foreign, every nerve on edge. But eventually, sleep found him again. Yet it was restless, full of images he couldn't quite remember come morning. And when he woke, the unease still clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The morning of Thanksgiving was a blur of activity. The Herringtons woke early, with Samantha in the kitchen bustling over a turkey and sides, the oven beeping in rhythm with her muttered instructions. The smell of roasting meat and baking yams filled the air, mingling with the crisp scent of the morning. Outside, leaves danced in a chilly wind, clattering like whispering ghosts across the driveway. Cameron wandered through the house, hands buried deep in his hoodie pockets. He hadn't said much since waking up, and the restless, broken sleep from the night before had left dark circles under his eyes. He tried to push the memories of the whispers away, but they lingered, nagging at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. "Hey, champ!" Brian clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. A smile stretched across his face. "You okay? You've been quiet all morning." Cameron nodded, but his gaze drifted to the front window. "Yeah, just tired." Brian followed his son's eyes to the yard. "Well, try to shake it off. Today's a big day, huh?" He squeezed Cameron's shoulder. "You've got cousins to impress with your video game skills, and I need your help setting up the dining table." Cameron forced a smile, but it felt like a mask. "Sure, Dad." The hours ticked by. Relatives arrived, bringing with them laughter, casserole dishes, and a sense of chaos that filled the house. Cameron's cousins rushed to the living room, their shrieks echoing off the walls as they debated which game to play first. Cameron found himself sitting on the couch, controller in hand, but he couldn't focus. His eyes kept drifting to the stairs, where his room lay in shadow. The unease festered. Samantha called everyone to the table, and the Herringtons gathered around, a vibrant crowd filling the dining room. Platters of food were passed back and forth, and Brian raised a glass of cider. "To family," he said, beaming at everyone, "and to making new memories in our beautiful new home." "Cheers!" The room echoed the sentiment, and for a moment, Cameron almost felt normal. The table was a picture of warmth, of togetherness. But as the meal went on, Cameron's appetite faded. He toyed with his mashed potatoes, barely listening to the adults' stories or his cousins' bickering. A sudden draft swept through the room, rustling the napkins and making the flames of the candles waver. "Did someone leave a window open?" Aunt Carol asked, shivering. She pulled her cardigan tighter, but no one answered. The adults brushed it off, but Cameron's hand tightened around his fork. That's when it happened. The whispers returned, faint and almost imperceptible, but Cameron heard it. He glanced around the room, but everyone else was deep in conversation, oblivious. The whispers weaved between the chatter, growing louder, forming a rhythm that made his pulse race. "Unforgiven, remembered in blood." Cameron's eyes darted to the kitchen doorway, and his heart leapt into his throat. A shadow moved there, slow and deliberate, watching from just beyond the light. He dropped his fork with a clatter, his hands trembling. "Cameron?" his mother asked. Concern flickered in her eyes. "You all right?" He tried to speak, to lie, and say that he was fine, but the words caught in his throat. The shadow shifted, almost as if it had heard his mother's question, and a cold, cruel laugh echoed in his mind. Cameron's head swam, and he felt himself sliding out of his chair, the room spinning around him. "Hey!" Brian was on his feet, grabbing his son before he could fall. "What's going on?" Cameron blinked, his vision clearing, and the shadow was gone. The whispers fell silent. He stared at the kitchen doorway, half expecting to see a figure still lurking, but there was nothing. "Just dizzy," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. I'm okay." The room was quiet, all eyes on him. But the unease had spread like a ripple in a pond. Samantha helped Cameron back to his chair, fussing over him, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the shadow, the way it had watched him with eyes he couldn't see but could feel. The rest of the meal passed in a blur, the atmosphere strained, and as dusk settled over the house, Cameron's dread only deepened. He knew one thing for sure: whatever was in their home, it was no longer content to stay hidden. The house was quiet after the Thanksgiving feast. A strange silence settled over the Herringtons as they saw the extended family out the door, cleared the table, and washed dishes. Cameron had retreated to his room, the door shut tight, but he hadn't turned on any of his games. Instead, he sat on his bed, his back pressed against the wall, knees drawn to his chest. He hadn't told anyone about the tomahawk. It lay hidden in his dresser drawer, wrapped in an old t-shirt he'd stopped wearing a while ago. Every time he thought about it, his pulse raced, the whispers creeping back into his ears, weaving in and out of the shadows. Downstairs, Samantha scrubbed at a casserole dish. The hot water steamed her glasses. She paused, rubbing her temples. "Ah," she muttered. A headache had bloomed behind her eyes, and she felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on her. Brian walked into the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Hey, you okay?" She shook her head. "Just tired. And this headache." He frowned, coming over to stand beside her. "You've been stressed lately. Maybe it's just..." The lights flickered, a stuttering of brightness and darkness that made them both look up. The chandelier in the dining room swung slightly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and reach across the walls. The room plunged into darkness for half a breath, and then the light surged back on. Samantha's hand flew to her mouth. "Brian, did you see that?" A crash erupted from the living room, the sound of something heavy and metallic slamming into the wall. Brian rushed to the living room entryway, his heart pounding, and found the fireplace tools scattered across the hardwood floor, the iron poker lying several feet from where it should have been. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping into the room. He looked around, but there was no one there, just the dying embers in the fireplace, crackling softly. "Brian?" Samantha called, her voice thin and uncertain. I'm not sure," he replied, but a chill had taken root in his chest, colder than the November air outside. Upstairs, Cameron stared at his reflection in the window. The glass had fogged slightly from his breath, and he watched as something moved behind him, a flicker of darkness, like a hand reaching out. He whipped around, his heart thundering, but the room was empty. He swallowed hard, sweat breaking out along his spine. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his head with a chorus of anger and grief. "Unfinished, unforgiven, blood spilled." He clapped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. "Go away," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Leave me alone!" The air grew thick, a suffocating presence pressing against his chest. The room felt colder, and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The door to his room burst open, and Brian stood there, his face pale. "Cameron, what's going on?" Cameron gasped, the pressure easing, the shadows retreating, leaving him trembling and small. "Dad!" he croaked, tears streaming down his face. Brian crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering his son in his arms. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm here." But Cameron knew it wasn't okay. Not anymore. Downstairs, Samantha stood frozen at the sink, her headache worsening until she felt like her skull would split open. She turned off the faucet, but the sound of water dripping persisted, echoing through the empty kitchen. The drips grew louder, morphing into a pounding that vibrated in her teeth. "Samantha," a voice whispered, soft and taunting. She spun around, a scream caught in her throat. The shadow in the corners of the room twisted and writhed, and she stumbled backward, clutching the counter. Her mind screamed that this wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening. But the shadows didn't care. They crawled closer, tendrils of darkness slithering along the walls, hungry and ancient. "Sam!" Brian shouted from the stairs, and the spell shattered. The shadows vanished, leaving her breathless and shaking. She collapsed against the counter, clutching her chest. Brian rushed into the kitchen, Cameron clinging to his side. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough with fear. Samantha couldn't speak, her hands trembling. She looked at her husband, at her son, and saw the same terror in their eyes. Something was very, very wrong, and whatever had come into their home wasn't leaving. The Herringtons sat huddled in the living room, the light from a single lamp casting a halo that seemed far too fragile against the encroaching darkness. Samantha held Cameron close, her arms wrapped protectively around him. Brian paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair. "We can't stay here," Samantha said, her voice cracking with tension. "Something's not right." "No," Brian whispered, his face pale. "We have to stay together. We can't run from whatever this is." Cameron's head rested against his mother's shoulder, but his eyes were wide open, thinking about the tomahawk tucked away and hidden. He knew, deep down, that it was his fault. The voices had told him so, over and over. "You unearthed the past. You invited the darkness." "Dad," Cameron finally said, his voice wavering, "there's something I need to show you." Brian paused, looking at his son with a mixture of dread and concern. "What is it, buddy?" Cameron hesitated, his hands trembling. He glanced at his mother, who squeezed his shoulder gently, silently urging him to speak. I found something," he admitted, guilt pooling in his gut. "In the woods. I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, the temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the windows. A low, guttural growl echoed through the house, reverberating through the walls and floor. The shadows gathered, thick and malevolent, swirling in a cyclone of darkness. Cameron ran and grabbed the tomahawk from its hiding place in his room and brought it to his dad, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. Brian's eyes met Samantha's, and he could see the fear and determination that mirrored his own. "What is this thing?" he demanded, though he knew no one had the answer. The shadows coalesced into a shape, a towering figure draped in spectral darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire, and its voice, deep and ancient, shook the very air around them. "You disturbed sacred ground," it intoned, each word dripping with rage. "Blood was spilled long before you came, and blood will be spilled again." Cameron clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The figure's eyes narrowed, focused on the boy. "The sins of the past demand a reckoning," it hissed. "An innocent soul for the suffering endured." Brian tightened his grip on the tomahawk, his heart hammering. "You can't have him!" he growled, stepping between the figure and his family. "Take me instead!" The spirit paused, considering him with cold, unfeeling eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though the offer might be accepted. But then, a cruel smile twisted across its shadowed face. "Sacrifices must be earned," it said. "Face the truth of this land's pain, and perhaps your family will be spared." Before anyone could react, the room exploded in a cacophony of noise and chaos. The shadows swirled faster, and the house shuddered as though trying to shake them off like insects. Brian held the tomahawk high, and a blinding flash erupted from the weapon, burning away the darkness momentarily. The spirit roared, vanishing in a flash of cold wind, and the house fell silent. The Herringtons stood frozen, their ears ringing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Brian lowered the tomahawk slowly, his hand numb from the cold. Samantha whispered, Is it over?" But before anyone could answer, the floor beneath them cracked, the foundation splintering as a chasm opened in the middle of the living room. Ghostly hands reached up, grasping for anything solid, pulling at rugs and furniture. Brian's eyes widened, and he grabbed Samantha and Cameron, pulling them toward the door. "Run!" he yelled, but the hands were everywhere, dragging them back, refusing to let them go. Cameron screamed, clutching his mother's hand as she fought to keep him close. The tomahawk fell from Brian's grasp, and it tumbled toward the chasm. In that final moment, Cameron closed his eyes and whispered, "Please, forgive us!" And then, everything went still. The night had grown cold, an unnatural chill seeping into the Herrington home. The oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to breathe, as if the very air carried a weight of sorrow and wrath. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, whispering voices echoing from nowhere. The family huddled together in the living room, wide-eyed and desperate, staring at the hole and the reminiscences of what was once their living room. Cameron grabbed the tomahawk off the living room floor. Its rusted blade seemed to hum with an ancient, dreadful energy. He couldn't escape the feeling that the artifact was searing into his palm, branding him as the cause of all this terror. "It's my fault," he said through tears. "I'm so sorry." His parents, pale and terrified, exchanged frantic glances. "We need to get out of here," his father insisted, reaching for his wife and son. But before they could even make it to the door, a gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing every light and slamming the door shut.
"No,"
a voice whispered from the darkness.
"You cannot run."
A cabinet burst open, dishes shattering on the floor. An invisible force yanked at the family again, pushing and pulling them with cruel hands. Cameron screamed, clutching the tomahawk tighter. With no other choice, he bolted toward the front door, driven by a desperate need to escape and make things right. His parents stumbled after him, horror twisting their faces. The door burst open, and Cameron ran out into the night, down the path toward the woods. The tomahawk throbbed in his grasp, heavier and heavier with each step. His parents' voices called after him.
"Cameron!"
But they were drowned out by the unearthly wails that filled the air. "Leave it!" his father shouted, catching up to him. But Cameron shook his head, sobbing. "I have to fix it! I have to give it back!" The woods loomed before him, the very ground seeming to tremble with fury. Cameron skidded to a stop near the ravine. The tomahawk slipped from his grasp. It tumbled, disappearing into the shadows below. He leaned forward, trying to see where it had gone, but then a frigid hand clamped around his shoulder. Cameron was pulled forward, his feet slipping on the muddy ground. His mother screamed, her hand just inches away, but an unseen force wrenched Cameron from her grasp. His father lunged forward, but it was too late. The boy's terrified eyes met theirs one last time before he was swallowed into the darkness. The forest fell silent. The whispers stopped. The wails ceased. All that remained was the echo of his mother's heartbroken cries, carrying through the trees and mingling with the wind. Weeks later, a for sale sign creaked in the front yard of the once cheerful Herrington home. The property stood silent, yet not at peace. In the overgrown grass near the edge of the woods, half buried in the soil, the rusted tomahawk lay still. It waited, cursed and patient, its hunger for vengeance never truly satisfied. The past cannot be silenced or ignored. True atonement requires acknowledgement, sacrifice, and understanding, or history will demand its due in blood. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening. This was my Thanksgiving-themed story. It was inspired by Amityville, but with a little bit of a different twist, more of a possessed item, and I like those kind of stories a little better. Okay, let's talk about the AI this time. This was mostly like 90% me. The only thing I asked it to help me with was to throw names, locations, and Native American history into the works of this story. And it created a smooth and seamless balance, which really made the story flow. I am very thankful for you listening, and always like, comment, and subscribe. I always say that it's the lifeblood of my channel and most of us creators' channels, and that can't be more true. If you leave a comment, I will respond. I love communicating with people about my stories, and I want to hear what you have to say. I have my Buy Me a Coffee link, and it's always appreciated. And as always, I post this story on YouTube and Rumble. And remember, it's okay to be scary. I am too. Embrace the strange, embrace family, embrace the things you are thankful for, and I will see you in the next story.